In Joshua chapter 23, picking up to get some context, Joshua gives two farewell addresses to Israel. One of them is in chapter 23, and he's in Shiloh for you Southerners. He's in Shiloh where the temple, where the tabernacle is. And in verse 24, we'll see a shift. They actually take a little trip, and Joshua gives his final address, his charge to Israel, from Shechem, the city of Shechem. And we'll talk about the city of Shechem and why that place is so important in just a minute. But in Joshua chapter 23, verse 6, just to pick up somewhere, this is what it says: be very firm. Joshua knows that his death is imminent. He knows he's in the last days of his life, at least the last season of his life. And so he is giving a charge to Israel to be very firm, to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses. So remember, God gave Israel the Mosaic covenant. He gave them 613 laws. They're not just 10. If you count every single command that God gave in the book of Exodus and Numbers, Leviticus and Numbers, there's 613 total. When your ox gores another man's ox, well, that's a command. So there are all kinds, 613 commands that God gave. He gave these commands to Israel so that they would know how to worship God properly. Remember all the laws about the tabernacle, the sacrifices, the anointing oil, the frankincense, all of the things of the tabernacle, the priest's clothing, the Urim and Thummim, the breastplate with 12 stones, all of those commands for Israel through the book of Leviticus in the Mosaic law. So they learn how to worship God. They learn how to be moral. Don't steal. Don't lie. All the things of the 10 Commandments. And they also learn ceremony. Ceremony in the sense of civil law. Civil. How, when I said like an ox gores another ox, what do we do? When your neighbor changes a boundary line, what do we do? All those things are found in the Mosaic law. And he gave these things for Israel so that they could live a proper life before God that would please Him. That is what the Mosaic law is. And so Joshua here in the last season of his life is telling Israel, keep the law. Do the law. Learn the law and do the law. This is Israel, not the church. But make no mistake, that's what's on Joshua's mind. How faithful Yahweh has been all this time in the fact that if you want to continue living at rest in the land, keep and do the law. Keep everything that's written in the book of the law of Moses. So that there's a reason why we should be in the book all the time. There's a reason why Joshua told Israel, keep the law and do the law, keep studying the law, keep learning the law, because the better you know the law, the easier it will be for you to keep yourselves from idols. Because you'll know what's true and you won't fall for the devil's deceptions. And so that's what he says at the end of verse 6, so that there's a reason to keep the law, to guard the law, to safeguard the law, and to act on the law so that you may not turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you will not associate with these nations, these which remain among you, or even mention the name of their gods. See, that's what's at stake here. Who are you going to worship, Israel? That's what Joshua's laying before them. If you don't cling to God, Yahweh, then you will fall for the idols of the land. And he's telling them, don't associate with these nations. Don't even mention the name of their gods. Don't even speak the names of their gods or make anyone swear by them or serve them or bow down to them. It's interesting that there are still, as he says in verse 7, Canaanites who remain with them. Because look at what God said to Israel before they ever entered into the land through Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 20. Look at what God wanted. This is what Yahweh instructed Israel to do when they went into the land of Canaan: kill everything that breathes. You've heard me say that before, but if you've never heard me go through Deuteronomy, maybe you didn't know those were God's words, not mine. This is what God wanted. In the cities of these people that Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance, the cities of the lands of Canaan, don't leave anything alive that breathes. That's man, woman, child, animal. That's everything that breathes there. God wanted the land cleansed of all pagan, non-God worshiping idolatry. He'd given them 400 years of grace. He told Abraham that. 400 years, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. He waited 400 years for people to turn to Him, and when they wouldn't, this was His direction to Israel: kill them all. You say, well, that's awfully harsh. I'm only reporting the justice of God. If He gives you 400 years and you still don't want Him and reject Him after 400 years, He is free to say, kill them all. It's exactly what He does. So the fact that there are still Canaanites in the land is a problem, because what God wanted was for Israel to go through and systematically kill all of them and take over their possessions, their houses, their flocks, their fields, etc. But we can see from this verse, hasn't happened. Verse 8 says, but you are to cling. What is Israel to do? To cling to Yahweh your God. You are to cling to the Lord your God as you have done to this day. So in the 30 or 40 years that Israel has been in the land after the 7 years of military conquest, 27 or 37 years go by. Joshua's on in his last days here. Israel has done a good job. They haven't totally gone into idolatry yet, not while Joshua is alive. But they're not doing a good job of cleansing the land from the Canaanites. So he says, look at what he says in verse 9, for the Lord has driven out great and strong nations from before you. And as for you, no man has stood before you to this day. So when you go into battle and you want to do what God wanted you to do, Deuteronomy 20 verse 16, when you go into battle and your intention is to kill everything that breathes, when you do that, God will destroy the armies from before you, your enemy from before you. But when you don't do that, they're going to stay in the land. But he says, so far, when Israel has been obedient to God, God has driven out great and strong nations, and no man has stood before you to this day. One of your men, one Jewish man, he says, puts to flight 1,000. So God is not only winning battles for Israel, but He's putting fear in the hearts of the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and all these other peoples in the land, that one Jew is able to put to flight 1,000. Yeah, it's a little bit of a stretch. But the fact remains, and let me say this, because it's been on my mind a lot lately. I've had conversations with people. You have to read the Bible like you would read any other book. You have to read the Bible like you would read any other book. It has to be read literally. But within that literal interpretation, you have to understand there's poetry, there's irony, there's humor, there's overstatement sometimes to make a Hebrew point. And this is one of those clear overstatements to make a Hebrew point. Simply the fact that one Jewish man putting to flight 1,000 men is hard to believe. But the truth is that there was a fear of Israel in the land of Canaan. So when the Jews marched in battle array, people were fleeing from them. Now what Israel should have done is chase them down and kill them all. We don't know the fact there other than the fact that Canaanites are still living in the land and they shouldn't be. One of your men puts to flight 1,000, for the Lord your God is He who fights for you, just as He promised you. So what Joshua is doing in these final statements of his life is lifting up God as the faithful God, the promise-keeping God. The Lord your God is He who fights for you, just like He said He would. And He'll keep doing that if you keep obeying Him. So in verse 11 he says, so take diligent heed to yourselves to love the Lord your God. And you could add the word only. No false gods. Love your God, Yahweh, the God of the nation Israel. Israel has gone into the land of Canaan, and every one of these Canaanite nations has their own set of gods. And Israel is going to be forced with all these Canaanite false gods. And what Joshua is saying is, God has been faithful to you for over 40 years in the land now. Keep being faithful to Him. Cling to God, he says. Cling to the Lord your God in verse 8. And here he says in verse 11, love the Lord your God. Only Him. No other gods. You should be killing the Canaanites and all their gods and be purifying the land. But you're not. And that's going to be a problem, as we'll see Joshua keep on going here in his words. He'll let them know you're not going to be able to do this. He knows the heart of the Jews, unfortunately. So we have to ask the question, what if we don't? You know, Israel is being told by Joshua, cling to the Lord, don't go to any idols, love Yahweh, only Yahweh. He's the faithful God who's brought you this far. And the question would have to arise, what if we don't? Are there any consequences for us turning away from Yahweh? And so he speaks in verse 12, knowing the heart of humans that are going to say, well, is there a way out of this? Can I do things my way, or is that going to be a problem? And so Joshua speaks to it in verse 12. He says, for if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, this is the word from verse 8. Circle these two words, if you will. Verse 8, he says cling. It's the Hebrew word dabak, D-A-B-A-Q. It's a word that means to cling to, like a husband grabs hold of his wife and holds her tight, his most treasured possession. So Joshua says, cling only to Yahweh, the one true God. And in verse 12, he says, don't cling to the rest of the nations and their gods. So you have this contrast. If you read the Bible more and more and more, you'll see over and over these contrasts, these choices. I placed before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Choose life that you may live, Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 30. These contrasts are all over the book. You've got good, you've got evil, you've got dark, you've got light. And here you have clinging to Yahweh, the one true God, or clinging to the gods of the nations. That's the choice of the people. And you know, ultimately at the end of this in Joshua 24, he says, you choose this day whom you will serve. Clinging to Yahweh or clinging to the gods of the nation. But as far as my household is concerned, we will serve Yahweh. So it's a choice. He's presenting Israel with a legitimate choice and urging them, even commanding them to continue clinging to the faithful God, the only God that exists, and don't be duped. If you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, who should have been killed, and you intermarry with them, that's the big problem. You start intermarrying with someone of another faith, someone who doesn't believe what you believe, someone who doesn't worship the God who you believe, who you worship. The household is going to start to splinter. The family is going to start to splinter. The clan is going to start to splinter. The tribe is going to start to splinter. And then the nation of Israel is going to be destroyed. And that's what happens. It starts with one, I do. If you intermarry with them so that you associate with them and they with you, Joshua lays it down in no uncertain terms. Know with certainty. If you worship the gods of the nations, if you start intermarrying with them, remember Israel was only to marry Israel. If you do that, there is a punishment. Know with certainty that Yahweh your God will not continue to drive these nations out, but they will be a snare to you. So what does God through Joshua promise Israel? If you want their gods, they will destroy you. There'll be a snare and a trap to you. There'll be whips on your sides. So that's not a pleasant thing to get whipped. There'll be thorns in your eyes. I mean, we get little bitty things in our eyes, little dust in our eyes. It'll drive you nuts. And that's what they're inviting. If you invite idolatry, if you invite the worship of a different God, This is what you have to look forward to. Why would you choose this? The question that always pops into my mind is when God makes it so clear what the consequence is to walking away from Him, the God of faithfulness, the God who's who's pulled us out of Egypt, who saved us at the Red Sea, who gave us manna and water and quail in the wilderness, who's done all these things for us, and who tells us, if you ever leave and worship and bow down before something else, it will destroy you. What is it in the heart of man that says, I'm going to take my chances? It's just mind-blowing to me. And what's the ultimate consequence? They have just come into the land. They're enjoying rest in the land. Again, they're living in houses that they didn't build. They're living in fortified cities whose walls they didn't build. They're eating from olive trees and fruit trees that they didn't plant. What's the alternative to that in this good land? You'll be kicked off of the land. You just got into the land, Israel. And look at the prosperity and the rest that Yahweh has given you. But if you want to intermarry, if you don't kill these people, if you leave alive anything that breathes, they will destroy you. You will become idolaters like them. I want them destroyed because after 400 years, generations after generation, they've raised nothing but non-Yahweh worshiping idolaters. And I want the land cleansed of that. And why did God want the land cleansed? Because God would dwell with Israel. God, the Shekinah glory, would live among above the mercy seat, the Ark of the Covenant, and the tabernacle, and later in the temple. God wanted His land pure. And Israel just wouldn't do it. We know that from the rest of the Old Testament. But He says there'll be a snare to you, there'll be a trap to you, there'll be whips on your sides, there will be thorns in your eyes until the ultimate punishment, until you perish from off of this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Why would you choose to leave this? Yet that's exactly what we'll see Israel do as soon as Joshua dies. As soon as this patriarch Joshua dies, Israel will turn away from the worship of the one true God. They'll start worshiping the gods of Canaan, who they were supposed to destroy, all the people that worship these gods. They'll start intermarrying with them. They'll do exactly what God and Joshua say not to do. That's exactly what they will do. Until eventually we'll see Israel removed from this land, because the land was supposed to be pure and purified, and Israel went into an unclean land and refused to make it clean, and then they defiled it with their own idolatry, even worse than it was when it was in the hands of the Canaanites. That's the history of Israel. In verse 14, Joshua again points to God's faithfulness. He speaks of the fact that he's in the last season of his life, but always with this focus on the faithfulness of God. Don't seek a new God is the point. Don't think their grass is greener on the other side of the street. It's not. Don't seek a new God and walk away from Yahweh to go worship some Canaanite false god. He says, now behold, today I'm going the way of all the earth. Today in this season. In this season, not actually today in this 24-hour period. He knows it's the last few days of his life. Today I'm going the way of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke, not one promise that God made to you, not one of the good words which the Lord your spoke concerning you has failed. He is perfect in His faithfulness to Israel. All have been fulfilled for you, not one of them has failed. So you think that's great. Wouldn't you want to stay living in a proper relationship with that God who makes promises and keeps promises? Look what he says in verse 15. Joshua, knowing the heart of these people, I mean, Joshua was there when the 10 spies said, we can't go in. Yahweh's not strong enough. The gods of the nations is basically what they were saying. They're stronger than us. They have fortified cities. They have giants. Their gods will fight for them and defeat our God. At the end of the day, make no mistake, that's what Israel did. What those 10 spies concluded. Their gods are stronger. Joshua was there for that. Him and Caleb were the two good spies who were saying, that's nonsense. Yahweh will fight for us. We need to go take the land. Joshua knows the heart of this people. He wandered around with them for 40 years in the wilderness eating manna. He knows the heart of this people. In verse 15 he says, it shall come about that just as all the good words which the Lord your God spoke, so all the promises, all the positive promises, I just want to read some of them to you just to get them in your head. What are these positive promises? What are you talking about? What is it that God promised Israel that He would do for them if they were obedient to Him? I'm getting there. Just listen. Now it shall come to pass if you diligently obey the voice of Yahweh your God, to observe carefully all His commandments which I command you today. Moses is speaking. You can write it down. I'm in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Moses says, if you keep the law, the commandments which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set, then the Lord your God will set you on high above all the nations of the earth. Is that good or bad? And all the blessings shall come upon you and overtake you because you will get blessings because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. That's what Joshua is saying. Keep obeying the voice of the Lord your God and get the blessings that He has promised you. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall be the fruit of your body, the produce of your ground, the increase of your herds, the increase of your cattle, the offspring of your flocks. So your wives will give birth to healthy babies. Your ground will give birth to healthy cattle. Your herds will grow. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. So the fields of wheat and grain and barley are going to be fruitful, and you're going to have all you can eat. Your kneading bowls will be full of dough all the time. You'll never want. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. That's an idiom that speaks of warfare. The Lord will cause your enemies who rise against you to be defeated before your face. You shall come out against, or they shall come out against you one way and flee before you 7 ways. Didn't Joshua just say that one Jew sends to flight 1,000 other men? It's the exact same thing Moses said earlier. The Lord will command the blessing on you in your storehouses and in all to which you set your hand, and He will bless you in the land. Within the land of Canaan, He will bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. But if, and then you have to turn to the but if in verse 15, but it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord to observe carefully all His commandments and His statutes which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Who in the world for 30 years who's been living under these type blessings, and Israel was living under those blessings, who on earth would say, I've had enough of the good life. I want to go live in the pig trough of the earth. I want to leave this God of blessing, and I want to choose to do this my way, and I'll suffer the consequences. Who is so stubborn that they would do that? Israel. And not only Israel, so we don't paint the picture at the Jew, because I love the Jew. I have a great-grandfather whose name was Lieberman. That's a Jewish name. But it's each one of us every time we know what to do, we know what is right, we know what's forbidden, we know how to walk, we know what forgiveness we should give, we know what grudge we should let go of, we know what love we should offer, we know what sacrificial giving we should do. And we say, nope, not going to do it. I'm going to do it my way. We choose this every time we sin. Every single time we sin, we choose to be the same stubborn fools that Israel was when they say, no, Lord, I don't want your blessings. I'll do it my way. I'm going to go check the grass out on the other side of the street. It's exactly what Israel does. And we're no better than Israel. There's nothing new under the sun. Different storylines. But the fact is, God remains faithful always, and men still stumble in unfaithfulness. Even Christians. Even Christians. So he tells them, just as all the good promises that God made in verse 15, just as all the good words which Yahweh spoke to you shall come upon you, or just as they have already come upon you, so the Lord, in the same way, the Lord will bring upon you all the threats. What are the threats? I just read some of them. Well, I'm gone out of it. But all these curses will come upon you. And your kneading bowls will not be filled. And your women will not give birth. And your cattle will not increase. The flocks and the herds of your field will not increase. As drought and famine and other things start coming on Israel. So Joshua says, you know these things. Moses has taught these things. God gave these things 40 years ago, 80 years ago now to Israel. The Lord will bring upon you all the threats until He has destroyed you from off this good land. When you open the Bible, if Israel is in the land of Canaan, that's the place where God wanted them. That's where they had the opportunity to enjoy His blessings from Deuteronomy chapter 28. If you read Israel out of the land, then they have been banished from the land by God from the pure land of Canaan, the promised land. They've been evicted because that's a holy land. And God will no longer let an unholy people live in that land. That's what goes on. So ultimately, the punishment for idolatry will be getting evicted from the land that they just came into 30 years ago, and that they've been enjoying numerous wonderful blessings from God in. Idolatry is going to get you kicked out of our land. And we know that that happened. I'll show you a couple of verses in just a second. So what God's answer is when Israel turns away, when they stop clinging to Him, like Joshua is urging the nation to do, keep holding on to Yahweh, the one true God, as your most treasured possession in this world, because that's who He is. He's eternal creator God. He's everything. Keep holding on to Him and deny the gods of the false gods of all these nations. Put them away. Don't even mention their names. Because if you do and you walk down that road long enough, I will kick you out of that land. I will say to you, you cannot live on this land anymore. I remind you of Exodus chapter 3, verse 5. Remember what God said in Exodus chapter 3? Exodus chapter 3 was the burning bush. When God first spoke to Moses, Moses approaches the bush. What does God say concerning the land on which Moses is? Where God dwells, where God makes His presence known, He changes that piece of earth. And when Moses was in the presence of the living God, what did God tell Moses? The first thing He told him. What did He tell him? Take off your sandals, because the ground on which you walk is holy. Why was it holy? Because God was there. And in the land of Canaan, God promised His existence to be above the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies, above the Ark of the Covenant. That pillar of cloud, that pillar of fire emanated from above that Ark of the Covenant. God was there. I will dwell among my people. I will be their God and they will be my people. And so when they turned away from Him being their God, He rejected the people. And He said, you can no longer live in this holy land. This is my land that I've chosen to live in on all the parts of the earth that God could have chosen to live right here in beautiful Sweeney, Texas. This could be the promised land. but it's not. Of all the created earth, God chose to dwell, personally dwell, to have an existence, a visible existence in Jerusalem, ultimately in Jerusalem, but anywhere that tabernacle was. And when you don't worship the one true God, Yahweh, He will leave. If you're not worthy to be His people, then He will leave. And that's exactly what He does. That's exactly what He will do to Israel. Look at verse 16. When you transgress the covenant of the Lord, I'm telling you, Joshua is telling them, I'm telling you, keep the law and do it. But when you don't do it anymore, because you think you've got a better way, when you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which He commanded you, and go serve other gods, it's almost like Joshua knows this is going to happen, isn't it? I'm drawn back into the distinction or the comparisons between Joshua and Moses, because Moses gave similar charges when he was going the way of all men. The difference in Moses' life is that God told Moses, these people won't serve me. And Moses knew when he was giving a final address to Israel, the end of the story. That Israel would eventually walk away from God, because God told Moses this, that Israel would walk away from God. They would break His covenant. Just write it down. I think it's important to make these comparisons. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 16, the Lord said to Moses, behold, you will rest with your fathers. Just like Joshua is about to rest with his fathers. You're going to die. You will rest with your fathers, and this people will rise and play the harlot with the gods of the foreigners of the land. Exactly what Joshua is telling them not to do. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 16. This people will rise, these are God's words, these people will rise and play the harlot with the gods of the foreigners of the land where they go to be among them, and they will forsake me. They'll walk away from their covenant with me. They will forsake me and break my covenant which I have made with them. And then my anger shall be aroused against them in that day, and I will forsake them. You never want to hear that out of God's mouth. I will hide my face from them, and they shall be devoured. And many evils and troubles shall befall them, so that they will say in that day, have not these evils come upon us because our God is not among us? They'll know what's going on. And I will surely hide my face in that day because of all the evil which they have done, in that they have turned to other gods. That's it. What's the first commandment? Exodus chapter 20. I am the Lord your God, and what? You shall have no other gods before me. And that's the trigger. And that's what God told Moses He would do. And here Joshua says, when you transgress the covenant, not if, but when. When you transgress the covenant of the Lord, just the way Yahweh in Deuteronomy 31 told Moses that you would. I wonder if Moses, very, very close friend of Joshua, ever told Joshua, hey Josh, did I ever tell you what God told me? I wonder if Moses, who was handing over authority, leadership in Israel to this man Joshua, I wonder if Moses shared these thoughts with Joshua. You make your own guess. I don't have a chapter and verse that says that. I would think he absolutely did. When you transgress the covenant, the Mosaic law, when you transgress the covenant of Yahweh your God, which He commanded you, and you go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly from off the good land which He has given you. That's exactly what God just told Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 31 would happen. And you see Jeremiah spout this out like he knows it's going to happen. So my question is, did it ever happen? Did it happen to Israel that they would walk out? And the other question is, while I give you 5 seconds, where in the Bible would you go to find that? Do you know anywhere in the Bible that would prove without question that Israel remained in the land all of her existence? She enjoyed the blessings of God. When Jesus the Messiah came, Israel accepted Him with whole arms, with a whole heart and open arms, because they were waiting for Him, expecting Him, wanting Messiah. And when Messiah came out of Nazareth, they hugged and held Him, clung to Him like a husband clings to her bride. Is that the story of Israel, or is it different? The story is different. So my question is, do you know, can you think of anywhere, and I'm not asking you to say it, but you have to know your Bible like this. If somebody says, you don't have any proof of that Israel walked away from God, I say, I've got an entire Old Testament. Let me take you to a couple of passages. You got to have those passages. You could go 100 different places, but in Jeremiah chapter 15, this is what we read. Remember what Jeremiah's nickname was? Anybody remember? He was the weeping prophet. Because Jeremiah lived in the days in which God is foretelling, and Joshua is foretelling now, the days when Israel would be kicked out of the land of Canaan. Joshua was an alive and living prophet through the days when Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army. That's why Joshua is the weeping prophet, because Joshua saw his people, Israel, given an opportunity to turn back to God, and they wouldn't do it. They considered Jeremiah, they considered Jeremiah a liar, a false prophet. How dare you prophesy that Jerusalem, the great Jerusalem, will fall to Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar? How dare you say that? You are a false prophet, not sent from Yahweh, and they put him in chains. But Jeremiah was the only true prophet in Israel. Indeed, who will have pity on you, O Jerusalem? Or who will mourn for you, or who will turn aside to ask about your welfare when you're destroyed? That's the context. You who have forsaken me, declares the Lord, you keep going backward. So I will stretch out my hand against you and destroy you. I am tired of relenting. Who said that last statement? Yahweh did. And what did He say? You keep going backward. You will not have me as your one husband. You will not cling to me with the faithfulness of a husband and wife relationship. If you don't know, God was the husband to Israel, the bride, played out in many, many chapters of the Bible. Ezekiel, Hosea is a great example of the fact that God was the husband and Israel was the bride. But God says, you keep going backwards. You have forsaken me. We had an agreement. We had a covenant. We had the Mosaic law. And you said to Moses, everything the Lord has spoken in the law, we will do. But you haven't done it. You haven't done it. You have forsaken me. The very first commandment, much less the rest of the 612, you tripped over number 1. I mean, imagine that. Think about that for a minute. The very first commandment is, I am the only God that's ever existed or ever will. Don't put any other God beside me in my midst. Don't even mention the name of another God. I'm a jealous God. I won't stand for it. I've created you to love me, and I created you out of love. We could have a wonderful relationship, even a wonderful eternal relationship. But what did Israel do? They forsook their relationship with their God. They went as a harlot does, as a wife, a cheating wife. They left the bed of their husband and went and found beds of foreign lovers. You think, oh, that's taking that analogy too far. Read Ezekiel chapter 16. I haven't even touched the analogy. God is brutal in Ezekiel chapter 16 with the infidelity that Israel treated him with. Brutal language. Very graphic. Very, very graphic. But I love Ezekiel chapter 16 because in verse 60, I think he says, "But nevertheless, even though you have done this in your unfaithfulness to me, nevertheless, I will remember my covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I'll remember my covenant to Israel. I will be faithful to my word, even though you are an unfaithful harlot wife, O Israel." He's quite the God. Quite the God. Jeremiah, let's turn back a couple of chapters to Jeremiah 13, answering this question, did Israel ever get kicked out of the land? The word of the Lord came to me. This is Jeremiah the prophet. He is speaking now because God gave him this word, and he says, "Thus says Yahweh, just so will I destroy the pride of Judah and the great pride of Jerusalem." I'm coming to destroy it. This wicked people who refuse to listen to my words, who walk in the stubbornness of their hearts. Do you see again a contrast? Listen to God's words or listen to your own heart. There's the contrast. There's the choice. And instead of following God and listening to His words and keeping and obeying His words, they have gone after other gods to serve them. We're going to try it our way. I just don't even understand it. We've had enough of this blessed life. It's insanity. It's almost masochism that you would want to harm yourself by refusing to listen to Yahweh because they lived at rest in the land for some time. This is an astounding expose of the human heart. This wicked people who refuse to listen to my words, who walk in the stubbornness of their hearts, have gone after other gods to serve them and bow down to them. Let them be just like this waistband, which is totally worthless. So God has Jeremiah put on a waistband, and it deteriorates. Look what he says in Jeremiah 13:11, just the next chapter. "For as the waistband clings," remember this word dabak, cling to the Lord your God. Hold Him as your only husband, Israel. "For as the waistband clings to the waist of a man, so I made the whole household of Israel and the whole household of Judah cling to me." We were betrothed. We were one. We were husband and wife. "That they might be for me a people for renown, for praise, and for glory." That's what God wanted in His relationship with Israel. How does it end? But they did not listen. They did not listen. But surely after God comes to earth, surely after God in the person of Jesus Christ comes to earth, surely after Jesus Christ, after 3.5 years of public ministry, raises people from the dead, gives the blind their sight back, makes lame people to get up and walk, surely after hearing and seeing what Jesus, God the Son, has done on earth, surely that will change the minds of Israel. Surely Israel will be a people for God and turn back to God, right? Wouldn't you think so? But what does Jesus, the Son of God, say in Matthew chapter 33, in Matthew chapter 23, verse 37, exactly what God said in Jeremiah in 586 BC, 600 years earlier. 600 years have gone by, no change in Israel. Listen to what Jesus said. What does God say? "I made them to cling to me, that they might be for me a people, that they would praise me and glorify me, but they would not listen." They didn't want me. They forsook me. And what does Jesus say? "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem," speaking of Israel, all the people of Israel, "the one who kills the prophets," like Jeremiah, "and stones those who were sent to her." What was God's desire through the person of Jesus Christ? He says, "How often I wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." You didn't want me. You forsook me. You forsook the relationship that I wanted to have with you. You wouldn't let me be your God. You rejected me as being your God, and you went and served other gods. Astounding what Israel does, the unfaithfulness of Israel. It was their choice. Again, the contrast, worship God and be blessed. Worship Yahweh, learn the Mosaic Law, keep the Mosaic Law, and be blessed in every area of life with untold overflowing blessings. Or choose to serve other gods and forsake me, and I will curse you. And that's what Joshua is telling the people here. Just as all the good words that the Lord spoke to you have come true, in verse 15, it shall come about that all the evil things, all the threats, all the curses will also come true if you don't listen to Him and follow Him, until ultimately He will destroy you from off of this good land which the Lord your God has given you. He'll kick you off. And unfortunately, we know from the book of Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, other places, that that's exactly what Israel did. They walked away from the Lord, and ultimately they were kicked off the land. In Joshua chapter 24, this is a second address. It's different from chapter 23, and I just want to talk about something for just a minute, and we'll close. We don't know how much time goes by between the speech in Shiloh, the first speech, Joshua 23, and this second sermon. We don't know. Could be hours, could be, well, not hours, but it could be days, weeks, months. It wasn't a long period of time, but we're just not told how much time was in there. But they are two separate sermons given at two separate locations. And look what it says in Joshua chapter 24. We're in the last chapter of the book of Joshua. I'm kind of sad. Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and called for the elders of Israel and for their heads and their judges and their officers, and they presented themselves before God. Why Shechem? Let me show you a couple of things that occurred in Shechem. Go all the way back 550 years earlier to the days of Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, where God first called Abraham out of the land of Ur of the Chaldees to go to a new land, a land which I will give him. And this is what happened in the book of Genesis. Abram passed through the land. What land? The promised land, the land of Canaan, the land that God was promising to give him and his descendants forever. So Abram does this journey. He travels all throughout the land as far as the site of Shechem. And when Abraham got to Shechem, he stopped and he did something. To the oak of Moreh. So there's a tree there. I wonder if that tree still stands. Who knows? God could make a tree last 4,000 years. I think He could do it. I have no idea whether that tree, I've never read anything about it, whether somebody claims it's still there. But Abraham got to Shechem to this oak tree and he stopped. From all his travels throughout all this land God promised him. The Canaanite was then in the land, which is interesting because the Canaanite in the book of Joshua, where we are, should already have been killed from the land. But in the days of Abraham, 550 years earlier, the Canaanite was in the land, which is interesting because you see this foreshadow of the fact that God will take the Canaanite out of the land and give it to Abraham's people. And that's exactly what He does in Joshua. Why would Joshua choose to go to Shechem? Look what happened there. That God would appear to Abraham, and He said, to your descendants I will give this land. So Abraham built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. An altar where he could worship God, where he would offer sacrifices, burnt offerings, animals to God. Understanding God's faithfulness to him. He builds an altar to sacrifice to Yahweh to show his faith in what Yahweh had just promised him. If he didn't believe the promise, to your descendants I will give this land, there would be no worship. But he heard those words, and Abraham fell down and worshiped Yahweh. He believed His promise that this land would one day belong to his children and his grandchildren and great-grandchildren forever. And what was his response to this faithful promise? He worshiped God. And so now you see Joshua in the last days of his life go to Shechem, where this land was first promised to Abraham. And he has the next generation of Israel renew the covenant with this God Yahweh. Renew their steadfastness to the Mosaic law. And that's what happens in the in chapter 24 of Joshua. There's this renewal of the covenant with God. He did it before. Joshua has already done this once. Let's read a couple verses. Turn back with me to Joshua chapter 8. Quick, we're running out of time. Look at what it says in Joshua chapter 8. Joshua has already done this almost 40 years earlier. And now he's going to do it again because it's been long enough for a new generation of people to rise in Israel. And look at what it says in verse 30. Joshua chapter 8, verse 30. There's a ceremony that goes on at Shechem. Then Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, in Mount Ebal. Now, there's Mount Ebal and there's Mount Gerizim. And in the middle of those two, in the valley, is the city of Shechem. This is where they are. Just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the sons of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses. So this is part of the Mosaic law, and Joshua is obeying it. He's taken Israel to Shechem. They made an altar of uncut stones on which no man had wielded an iron tool, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. That's exactly what will happen and what is happening in Joshua chapter 24 at the new altar. He wrote there's a ceremony. What occurs there? He wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written in the presence of the sons of Israel. So he whitewashes the stones on Mount Ebal, and he writes the laws of Moses, probably just the 10 Commandments. And all Israel with their elders and officers and their judges were standing on both sides of the ark of the covenant, before the Levitical priest who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Not only Jews, the stranger as well as the native. The stranger, the Jews and the Gentiles were there to worship God. Half of them stood in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had given command to bless the people of Israel. Joshua was doing this ceremony at Shechem for a reason, because Moses told him to. What does he do after he writes the law? In verse 34 it says, then afterward he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse. What is Joshua doing in Joshua 23 and 24? Just as God promised to do all the good things, and he has done every one, he will also promise the evil, the curses, and he'll do those too if you disobey him. He read all the words, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel. He read the book of Leviticus. He read the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus. He would have read the book of Numbers. All the places where the law was given, he read all of it to Israel. There was not a page, not a word that he commanded, which Moses had commanded Joshua, or which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, with the women and the little ones and the strangers who were living among them. So what happened in Shechem? This is where God first promised Abraham, this land is yours. This land is Jewish. I'm giving it to Israel for all time. Shechem. What also happens at Shechem? Joshua started there after the first battle in Israel in the land of Canaan. Joshua stops fighting. In Joshua chapter 8, he leads all people to Shechem, and he says, we must confirm our relationship with this God. We have to dedicate everything we are to the worship and keeping of God's Mosaic law. We are now in the Holy Land. And that's what he does. So it's no mistake that at the end of Joshua's life that he would call Israel back to Shechem. Places have meaning and importance. And he's called them back to Shechem so they can renew their relationship to the Mosaic law and to their God Yahweh in the last days of Joshua's life. It was the only fitting place for this to take place, that Joshua's Jewish countrymen would commit yet again to keeping the law in the land as they see their leader Joshua dead and buried very soon. He wanted them to renew their covenant and their commitment to God. A new generation has risen up. They've been in the land almost 40 years, and they have to confirm their relationship with Yahweh before Joshua is taken. A lot to chew on. If you have any questions, want to talk about it anytime, you got my phone number. I'm here right now. We can talk about this stuff anytime, any day. I want you to know this stuff. I want you to learn it because it's important. All Scripture is God-breathed and profitable. We go to the Old Testament and say, oh, we're in the Old Testament again. It's because God says all Scripture is breathed out by Him and is profitable. So far be it from you to say, I don't like that. Or far be it from me to say, I don't like that. We study and teach the full counsel of the Word of God because God said so. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father,